Welcome everybody to this session on Western political thought. In this session, we will discuss a very important issue, that is Hegel's understanding of, or Hegel's concept of the state. Since you are, as I understand, since you are already familiar with the method of Hegel, the way Hegel developed the dialectical method in order to explain his ideas, so far as his understanding of state is concerned, here we will see how he actually applies the method of dialectics. And this we will see Hegel accomplishes, or Hegel achieves, in a very unique manner. To start with, we have to address two central concerns of Hegel so far as his understanding of state is concerned. The first point is, or the first issue is, that Hegel's theory of state is completely different from the liberal understanding of state. And as a result, we will see it later, Hegel has been, or Hegel's understanding of state has been very seriously questioned, and a number of objections have been raised by the liberal political theorists. So, in what sense Hegel's theory of state or Hegel's understanding of state is different from the liberal understanding of state? So this we have to first of all examine. The second concern of Hegel is that Hegel arrives at an understanding of state by applying a methodology which, as you know, is dialectical. So how Hegel accomplishes it, that is methodologically how Hegel accomplishes his goal, so that is the second concern. So one issue is the theoretical concern, that is how Hegel distinguishes himself from the liberals. The second is a concern of method, how methodologically he establishes or he applies a unique method in arriving at his understanding. Now, regarding the first issue, what is the liberal understanding? The liberal understanding, as all of you know, is, for instance, associated with the contractualists. Now, what is that understanding? The understanding is this: it is the individuals who, through a kind of contract, play the major role, play a crucial role, play a very active role in constructing the state. That is, the state is authored by the individuals. Now, Hobbes does it in one way, Locke in another way. But the point is that in liberal political theory, the state is a product of individual action, individual will. In Hegel, it is completely different. It's completely different in the sense that for Hegel, the state is actually a product of the spirit. It is an expression of the absolute. Since you are already familiar with Hegel's methodology, I can now argue that, and this is very interesting in Hegel, that man is the highest expression of the spirit, and state also is an expression of the spirit. Since everything that we come across in the objective world is an expression of the spirit in one way, in different ways, on different levels. So, man and state both are products or expressions of the absolute. Therefore, Hegel at the very beginning establishes the proposition that there is no conflict between man and state, both being expressions of the absolute. Now Hegel tries to explain or tries to argue, and this is what he exactly intends to do, is that unlike the liberal understanding, which perhaps all of you know, which tries to profess, which tries to argue that there is a necessary conflict. That is a typical liberal understanding, a kind of, if we don't use the expression conflict, we can use the expression tension also, between state and the individual. In liberal understanding, the state is always a suspect in the eyes of the individual. State is always considered as a threat, as something external to individual. State is believed to be a kind of institution which aims at curbing the freedom of the individual. The entire liberal tradition, with its focus on the autonomy, freedom, and the rights of the individual, well, it considers the state as something which is necessary, of course, in the life of the individual, but only to a minimum level. That is, the maximizing role of the state, it is just a taboo for liberal political theory. For liberalism, the state is a threat to the individual. The state is necessary in the life of the individual only if the individual's rights are violated, if only the individual's freedom is violated. So the state actually comes to the rescue of the individual if the individual feels that his rights and freedoms are threatened. Beyond this, the state has no other role to play. So, traditionally, liberal political theory considers the state or views the state in a spirit which one can say is a spirit of suspicion. So it is this negative view of the state which characterizes liberal political theory. Now, what about Hegel? Hegel's proposition is something which is revolting for any liberal political theorist. Hegel argues that there is no conflict, no tension between individual and the state. On the contrary, the individual becomes free. The individual realizes his own individuality. The individual flourishes. The individual is able to develop all his possibilities and potentialities. The individual is able to develop his individuality to the highest level only by being a member of the state. Now, not only by being just a member of the state, but by accepting the authority of the state, by surrendering before the authority of the state, before the altar of the state. Now, how to explain this point? To explain this point, we have to look at two very important elements underlying Hegel's method. The first point is, methodologically, Hegel is following in the footsteps of Aristotle. If we go back to Aristotle, then we find that Aristotle made that very famous statement, the statement with which perhaps all of you are already familiar, that is, the state is prior to the individual. First the collective, then the individual. The individual becomes a proper individual. That was the typical Aristotelian understanding of the Greek city-state. That is, the individual in ancient Greece, according to Aristotle's understanding, could become a true, proper individual only by accepting the authority of the polis, only by member of the polis, only by participating in the life of the polis, the individual could become a proper individual. That was a classical Greek understanding. Now, this is the understanding precisely which goes into the making of Hegel's understanding of state. That is, only by being a member of the state, only by accepting the authority of the state, only by surrendering before the collective of the state, the individual becomes free. The individual becomes a true, a proper individual. So this is one element. That is, it is Aristotelian understanding. It is Aristotelian outlook which goes into the making of Hegel's understanding of state. This is one aspect. So, methodologically, Hegel to a large extent is influenced by Aristotle's understanding. Aristotle's focus on the whole, Aristotle's understanding that the individual and the state, they're inseparable, that there is no conflict between the individual and the state, that the individual becomes meaningful only in relation to the state. This understanding, which challenges that liberal understanding, well, this understanding goes into the making of Hegel's theory of the state. What is the other methodological aspect of Hegel? And there we come across how Hegel actually uses the method of dialectics. For Hegel, the understanding is this, and that is the premise. There is no conflict between the individual and the state. The state is a collective, whereas the individual apparently is opposed to the collective. The domain of the individual and the domain of the state, they are two different opposed domains. One represents the domain of individuality, domain of freedom, domain of rights, domain of autonomy. That is the domain of the individual. What about the state? Well, the state's domain, that is the domain of the collective, where you have power of the state, where you have where you have the authority of the sovereign, where you have the authority of power and control and domination. So apparently, one can very easily argue by using one's common sense that how do you reconcile these two things? The two domains are completely not only different, the two domains are opposed to each other. And the typical liberal argument is precisely based on this understanding. The two domains are opposite, the two domains are opposed to each other, and they cannot be reconciled. That is the typical liberal understanding. What about Hegel? For Hegel, the two things which are opposed to each other, there is actually no conflict or not tension. They have to be united. That is, it is a unity of opposites. The domain of the individual and the domain of state, the domain of freedom and the domain of control, the two things are not actually opposed to each other. They are apparently they are opposed to each other. But while being opposed to each other, they can also be reconciled. And there has to be a reconciliation, there has to be a union, there has to be a kind of synthesis of the state and the individual. Now the point is how it is done. Hegel's understanding is like this. And now I very briefly put before you the arguments of Hegel, how Hegel accomplishes it. Hegel's understanding is this. Hegel believes that when an individual is born, the individual is born in a family. After some time, the individual begins to feel that simply by living within the family, the individual cannot realize his individuality. The individual to become a true and proper individual, eventually after the individual begins to grow up, as the child begins to grow up, the child begins to feel that I have to step out of the family and I have to step into a larger domain. Therefore, it is understandable, and Hegel makes it very clear, that although the individual is born in family, but family cannot be his final unit. You have to look for a larger unit, and only with reference to a larger unit, you can realize the possibility of your own self. So in order to realize the potentiality of yourself, in order to realize that you are a true, proper individual, you cannot confine yourself to the domain of the family. So you have to step out of the family as you as an individual begin to grow up. So the next stage for Hegel is a larger domain. That is, when you grow up, you step out of the family and you step into a larger domain. This larger domain Hegel characterizes as civil society. Civil society in Hegel's time, by that Hegel meant actually a cluster of different groups, organizations, associations. That is the domain of, say, what we broadly characterize today as the domain of the private sector. That is, or you can put it, I think that would be a better expression, that is a non-state sector, where you are free to join any association, any group, any club, any business organization. You run your own enterprise, you run your own business, you say you build up your own shop, you join some, say, film club, you join some association, you join some political party. It is like this. So you encounter a world which is characterized by a variety of, by a whole range of different associations, groups, etc., but which are, all of which are autonomous in their own way. There is no, as such, no control over them. They are free to operate, they are free to work, they are free to function. So in this domain, this larger domain, which Hegel describes as civil society, the individual gets the taste of a bigger life, a larger life, a life larger than his or her family. But then Hegel, and that is his next step, then Hegel cautions us. Hegel argues that yes, you step out of family, you step into a larger domain, but even through your association with civil society, through your association with this larger domain, through your association with this huge cluster of organizations, associations, groups, their activities, etc., you cannot realize your goal, in the sense you cannot realize your individuality in a proper manner. Your individual still continues to be curbed. Your individuality is not yet fully accomplished. You as an individual, you as a proper human being, you are yet to achieve your goal. That is, you are yet to achieve your fulfillment. Now, how to realize, that is, in other words, how is it possible for an individual to realize that he is a fully grown individual who has infinite powers, who has infinite powers of creation? So, how to accomplish it? For that, Hegel says, you have to look for a larger domain. You have to look for a larger domain, and why? The answer is, there are actually two explanations. The first explanation for Hegel is this: if you confine yourself to civil society, then you become associated with certain sections of society. Say you join a particular political party, you join a particular group. Now all these groups, their activities, they are guided by certain kind of selfish private interests. So you are actually guided by considerations of selfishness. You join only those groups, you join only those activities, you share the functionings of those organizations, etc., which actually help you to develop only that kind of interest which you think, well, it is of interest to you. You require a larger exposure, and that larger expression, and that is his second explanation, you require a larger domain. In fact, the largest domain. And this largest domain is the state, the biggest domain, the widest domain. That is the domain of the state. The state actually being an expression of the absolute, and the individual, that is man, the human being, also being an expression of the absolute. Because absolute, actually, according to Hegel, the absolute reaches its highest expression through the human mind. So the human mind actually reaches its fulfillment only by being a member of the state. So according to this argument, the state being a domain which is an expression of the absolute, and the individual being also the highest expression of the absolute, there is no conflict between the state and the individual. The individual, by accepting the authority of the state, reaches its highest expression. Now, the point that has to be noted in this connection is this. You can guess that this is a kind of argument which Hegel tries to justify. That is, this whole idea that the individual becomes free. There is no conflict between the individual and the state. The individual reaches its highest goal. The individual reaches its individuality, accomplishes his individuality. The spirit of individuality is realized only by being a member of the state, by accepting the domain of the state. Now, this is an understanding which obviously was unacceptable to those who believed in liberal values. So they argued that actually Hegel plays here, with the help of his philosophy, a kind of trick. Now, what is the trick? The trick is he actually sacrifices the individual. The individual is eclipsed before the domain of the state. And therefore, the very standard argument against Hegel is this: all liberals in all their writings have questioned the claims of Hegel, have attacked Hegel, and have argued that Hegel's understanding, it ultimately is a justification of authoritarianism. It is a kind of justification of, say, the absolute power of the state over the life of the individual. You justify the state in absolute terms. You actually, what you do is you sacrifice the individual at the altar of the state in the name of a dialectical argument. That is, the individual and the state, although they are apparently two opposite domains, dialectically they can be synthesized. That is a dialectical unity of opposites. So this is the very standard argument. But modern commentators say, for example, I will use two names. One is Charles Taylor, a very leading commentator on Hegel. One is Lawrence Dickey. He has also very extensively made commentaries on Hegel. So, particularly Hegel's political writings. Now, if we look at their writings or their interpretation, and particularly relevant here is Lawrence Dickey's interpretation. Lawrence Dickey, he edited actually Hegel's political writings, and incidentally, you should also know that Hegel's theory of the state, he developed it, of course, in many writings, but the most important text of Hegel, where he developed his theory of the state, it is called The Philosophy of Right. Now, Lawrence Dickey, in his interpretation of Hegel's understanding of state, has put before us a very unique interpretation. And with that interpretation, I will close my discussion. Lawrence Dickey's interpretation is this: why Hegel was so much concerned with the defense of the state, why he believed, and Lawrence Dickey argues Hegel very sincerely believed, that the individual, by accepting the domain of the state, by living within the domain of the state, and thereby by championing the cause of the state, well, the individual becomes a true, proper individual. Now, what exactly was the purpose of Hegel in arriving at this kind of fantastic proposition, which is opposed to our typical, traditional, liberal understanding? In fact, anybody can say that this is a kind of understanding which shows that Hegel was opposed to democracy. Hegel was a defender of authoritarianism, because Hegel was ultimately, say, sacrificing the individual at the altar of the state. But why did Hegel do it? What was his purpose? The purpose, according to Dickey's interpretation, is very significant and interesting. Hegel, since he was very strongly influenced by the Greek understanding of polis, Hegel believed that in Germany at that time, in fact Germany at that time was not yet united Germany. So Germany was divided into so many principalities, in so many different regions, so many different states. So what was necessary at that time, this was Hegel's dream, that you require an active, vibrant citizen who will identify himself with the collective authority of the German state. But what actually happened in Germany at that time was that the individuals, they aligned themselves only with sectional interests of German society. And therefore, what was necessary was that you have to project the image of an individual who will be able to identify himself with the image of a complete, holistic German state. This was the understanding of the Greek polis. That is, an active Greek citizen becomes a true, proper citizen, or if you have to characterize someone as a citizen who is active and vibrant, then you have to identify yourself with the polis. Only by identifying yourself with the polis, you become an active, vibrant citizen, and thereby you become an active, vibrant individual. In Germany also, this exactly was the need of the hour. That is, you have to identify yourself with a holistic German state, a German state which was not yet born, but a German state which had to be created. And therefore, you require that kind of individual who will reconcile himself, will identify himself with the cause of a German state of the future.